If you can talk about just how devastating generational silence is, even on a personal level, and how it's affected you.
Generational silence is something that can impact the length of your life. And that is what I learned when I was 35 years old and I was diagnosed with thoracic endometriosis.
We're stepping high, we're chasing dreams. Selena Hill, setting the scene. Life's a story, let's unfold. Sharing wisdom, tales untold.
Hey fam, and welcome to Over the Hill, the podcast that helps you ascend to new heights in relationships, success, and finance, and empowers you to live the life you deserve. I'm your sister in purpose, Selena Hill, and I'm super excited to be joined by award-winning mental health advocate and best-selling author, Nicole Russell-Wharton. Nicole is also a certified trauma-informed healing instructor and the founder and executive director of Precious Dreams Foundation, a global nonprofit that advocates for mental health and the well-being of children. Furthermore, she's the owner of Restorative Commons, which promotes equity by way of rest and resources for advocates and community change makers. Today, I'll talk to her about her new book, Breaking Generational Silence, a guide to disrupt unhealthy family patterns and heal inherited trauma. Nicole, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Selena. It's such a pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
Amazing. So, I want to start this conversation by understanding generational silence. That's probably the first time I've ever even heard of it. And it's so funny because, and I talk about this with my family all the time, like my grandmother and great uncle, they were from the silent generation. And I remember when I used to try to ask them questions, especially my grandmother, she wouldn't answer. So my grandmother, she was from Charleston, South Carolina. And I knew just chronologically that her grandparents were slaves. So when I would ask her, were enslaved, when I would ask her questions about, how she grew up in the South on a farm and how her father had so much land and if she knew her grandparents or anyone who happened to be enslaved, she was very silent about it. She was like, that's not something we talked about. I can't. And she got very uncomfortable. And, it sort of started there, like me just being a child, just very curious. I remember her answer about that and just even other things in the family when it came to like health and how people were doing. And I remember, I just kind of felt like they were trying to protect me. Like I had a cousin who was incarcerated and they never told me. They were like, they would just say things like, he's away or, and I just never fully understood just a lot of things like within the family that was going on. And again, I just felt like maybe just keep it they wanted to keep me in a child's place. But even now, as a full-grown adult, I still feel like in our family, we're not always forthcoming when it comes to health issues, health crisis, and then even just like the elders in our family, they still feel a little, I think, uncomfortable talking about ancestors' heritage and, those family members that were enslaved or had a direct connection to that. So again, I want to bring it back to your book because when I think generational silence, I'm thinking the silent generation and my grandmother and that. But if you can define generational silence, what that means, and give us some examples of it.
Absolutely. So, generational silence actually only refers to a minimum of two generations that are avoidance or just choose not to speak about particular topics within the family. And so, it could be a range from finances and money to religion to dreams and aspirations to the family history, things that have actually happened, experiences, whether positive or negative. They can all kind of fall under this category of generational silence. And even just in listening to you, I can absolutely relate to everything you just said. And I think so many other people can as well. As kids, we're curious. And even as young adults, we're trying to really figure out who we are, and allow some of that family history to help shape this idea of what our own identity is. And for so many generations, our families felt that remaining silent was their way of protecting not only those who were living, but those who had passed. And so I think more recently, we are learning as we do more work and dive into our mental health that there actually are harmful impacts of silence. And so now, for me in particular, I was inspired to write this book because my own personal experience of feeling the harm firsthand. But you can point to it in every family, in every situation. There is silence that can be good, and there are times when silence is necessary. But silence can also be extremely painful and harmful, and have an impact that affects multiple generations.
Yeah, and I definitely, we're going to take a deep dive into how it's affected you and your family. But to just stay on the general topic, because I think that affects Black families even more so. I feel like we've been taught to internalize our pain, because if you think about it, just the connection again to slavery, if you were too loud, brought too much attention to yourself, you were penalized. We weren't allowed. We didn't have a safe space to express pain or grievance, or, we just weren't. We didn't have that. And I think that that's been passed on to us generationally and even today. And I know we're going to talk about the health crisis in your life. And when I was reading about it, I was thinking about how just last week, a family member of ours told us that they have COVID and could not have a family gathering. We found out through the grapevine they had a heart attack. And to this day, and again, this just happened, to this day, when I found out, I was told, do not communicate this to anybody in the family. And the one person that the person told, who had the heart attack, the one person he told my mother, who told me. And it's just like, I kind of felt a little odd. Like, if he is in the hospital, we have to act like we don't know why. We have to, we can't pay him a visit. We can't check up on him, because we have to continue to act like it's a mild case of COVID, which is what they said. So again, and I want to bring this to your story, Nicole, because again, when I was doing research, your story, I felt very connected. And I'm just like, this generational silence that we have is still in our families. It's still very relevant, and it's still affecting us.
Yeah, definitely. And again, like, I can relate to that as well. I definitely, even today, still have family members that hide their pain, hide their health scares, like emotional expression of any type, like grief or anger or frustration. Back in the day, it was seen as a sign of weakness, and it could potentially lead to punishment. And so this is something that was taught and it was passed down. And I don't think that our ancestors understood the impact that it would have, because that is how they survived. And that is what worked for so many years. Unfortunately, we are privileged because we are able to see the difference in being able to share, being able to ask for help, and being helped when we're asked. It's just not a privilege that our ancestors were provided. And so now we can understand that there's bigger implications in staying silent. And so we don't have to anymore. And it's really difficult to kind of reach back and help our elders understand that they don't have to live like this anymore, even though this is something they have done their entire lives.
Yeah, it's almost ingrained in them. I remember the first time I traveled to Tulsa to cover the massacre of Black Wall Street, the 1921 massacre that led to the destroying Black Wall Street. And when I was talking to the Black Tulsans there, and I was asking them about what they knew about what happened and the family, and asking them about the family members that were directly affected, I remember like they would like lower their tone and bend over and like they were like whispering about this tragedy. And at that time I
Hmm.
couldn't understand it, and now I sort of see it as like a way that black people as a collective almost in this country process and express trauma and pain. We're very silent about it, or we minimize it, or, you know, we're not, to your point, Nicole, as expressive as we should be.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, and truly, it's because of all of the years of suppression and all of the years of really trying to prove that we are good enough, to prove that we belong, to prove that we're okay. There's so many years of us facing dehumanization in this country, and even today, like, I can admit that I even have times where I struggle in the workplace, feeling like I need to work harder, be smarter, have all the right answers. You can't show all your cards. And it's because I'm a Black woman. Um, I don't have the same grace. I don't have the same privileges that other people have to show up and make mistakes each day. And it's really unfortunate that that is the story, and that is the truth of where we are. But we have to find another way. We have to keep going. We have to break through not just the silence, but break through these generational gaps, the generational gap of income, all of the things. There's a lot of hurdles that we need to overcome, but that's why we're having this conversation today, and that is why we're doing this work.
Absolutely. We have to break the cycle of suffering in silence, especially as a people, as a community, as a culture, as a collective. And, to bring it back to your book, I'm so glad that you are breaking generational silence. I read that at 35, you were diagnosed with a life altering genetic condition that was life threatening to you. And it was something that was, I don't know if it was hereditary or there was some type of family connection. And if you only would have known, I'm sure it would have been helpful and impactful. I don't even know. Maybe it could have been prevented. So if you can talk about just how devastating generational silence is, even on a personal level, and how it's affected you.
Generational silence is something that can impact the length of your life. And that is what I learned when I was 35 years old and I was diagnosed with thoracic endometriosis. It is a chronic illness that I have likely lived with for my entire life. It is something that can absolutely be passed through the genes. And once I learned about the symptoms, um, I was able to recognize that this is something I had in common with women in my family who came before me. And those women, while some of them were not diagnosed, some were. And if only we had had those conversations sooner, I could have done the work that was needed to manage this illness and prevent it from spreading throughout the body.
Mm.
Endometriosis does not need to be a whole body experience, but it can be if left untreated. And so, in my case, it spread to the lung and caused multiple lung collapses. Um, and I almost died. And, you know, I was left with needing to heal, obviously, physically from the surgeries and from the trauma. But I was left with a sense of frustration because I had these revelations after coming forward and sharing my story that there were multiple women still alive in my family today that also have endometriosis, and none of us picked up the phone to talk about it with others. And if only we had done so the second I had the signs that something was off, I could have I could have actually advocated for myself in the physician's office. And when I was gaslit and told maybe this is a mental health disorder, maybe you're not actually physically feeling pain, but it's mental, I could have stood up for myself and said, no, I actually would love for you to check for endometriosis. This is something that runs in my family.
Wow, Nicole, and thank you for sharing that. And I know you speak very openly about that experience. And you said multiple story surgeries because your lung collapsed, and it did not even have to get to that level. After you found out that multiple women in your family were had the same condition, were you able to finally have a conversation with them and get a better understanding of what they've been going through?
Yeah, you know, in some cases, and I think everyone will see this as they do the work, you will have those family members that are very open and willing to engage in back and forth dialogue. And then you will also have some family members who will choose to just listen. And so, that was the case in many situations where there were women who were like, yeah, well, that was your situation. That's not mine. And, they took it for what it was and shared the minimal. Um, and that was okay because I accepted that they were not ready to do additional work. Me, on the other hand, having this near death experience, I wanted to heal in every way possible. It was no longer enough for me to understand my mental health needs or to just get up each day and do physical activity. I wanted to know as much as possible about my gene expression and what I was carrying in my body so that I could do the work, so that I could create the diet, so that I could live my life preparing for whatever may come ahead. And just, give myself a fighting chance to be here as long as possible.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that some of the family members were not even open. I guess you're saying to this day to speak openly about the the condition. Um, what do you tell those of us who no longer want to suffer in silence, who want to initiate conversations with family members? How do you start that conversation, and also how do you prepare for it? Because, like you said, some family members may not be open, and that may leave you feeling rejected if they don't want to engage in that conversation.
hmm Yeah. So, there's two different ways to go about it. I recognize that not everyone is privileged to have conversation in the first place. There are people who grew up in foster care or, may have disconnected from their biological families at some point, and so they may not have access to people to go back and have conversations, but they do have the right to still know and find out as much as possible about their genes. A lot of the work that I had to do for the silent side of my family was going online and looking at public records. I was
Mm.
pulling death certificates, I was pulling birth certificates. You'd be amazed how much you can find out about someone through their death certificate and how much you can learn about your family's health with that information as well. I mean, I was finding things like heart disease and heart attacks and all types of different issues that I didn't even know my family dealt with. So definitely looking for public records is something that everyone can do online. DNA testing, that's another way to learn as much as you possibly can about your family history and to try to connect with people in the family if you don't have those relationships today. And I actually use some of my research to engage with the silent side of my family. So
Mm.
I found that sharing information was helpful and beginning that engagement and getting them to open up and at least listen and to hear me. As you were mentioning earlier, stories weren't told, limited information was passed down. And so I was calling my father, whose father was murdered when he was a child, and I was sharing information with him about my grandfather's family that he never knew about. I was telling my father things about his grandmother and children that he had that my father never knew about or never got to meet. And so my father didn't see it as me asking these intrusive questions or, me bothering him with trying to dig for information that he felt was unnecessary. He was grateful in a sense. You know, I would call him on Sundays when I knew he was the most relaxed and just finished watching basketball. And I would say, "Hey, Dad, like, guess what I just found out?" Or, "Did you know this?" Or, "Have you ever heard about this?" And, I think he really appreciated it, especially because some of those older people who he would have learned from are no longer here. So he can't just pick up the phone and find out any other way. Um, so that was one of my main entry points with the silent side, like just finding information, doing the research, and bringing it back to people. And then for those who were willing to engage, I asked open ended questions. And I also was as vulnerable as possible. You have to be vulnerable and you have to be honest. About your own experiences if you want someone to feel safe within your presence. And so, I was picking up the phone and calling my mother and calling my aunts and my uncles and my cousins and, telling them things that had happened to me and, what I was learning through my own therapeutic practices and asking them if they had tried similar things or if they had ever experienced this. And so I think they saw that vulnerability in me and it made them feel less guarded. Those are a few things that I would absolutely recommend for people who do want to have these conversations. And then finally, I would just say go in with no expectation and no timeline because just because you are ready to do this work and you are ready to engage doesn't mean someone else is. So, provide the invitation, let them know that you're here and that you want to share and that you want to talk. And if they choose to meet you, amazing. If they choose not to, maybe they'll come back later.
That's great advice. And I just want to piggyback on what you said about being vulnerable and honest because that's the best way to start any honest conversation. It really does start with self. And another thing that starts with self is letting go to the shame that I think we often attach to health issues and any trauma, anything that goes on in our life that doesn't make us look perfect, to an outside perspective. And I think that is what has really been silencing so much of so many of us and so many of the people that we love. It's because we attach things to shame. We attach slavery to shame. Like my grandmother, again, she felt very shameful. And me as a millennial, I was just like, why? It wasn't your fault. This type of oppression and systemic injustice we shouldn't be carrying that burden of shame. But she did. And even when I went to Tulsa and I went to Memphis, I remember to commemorate the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And because it happened in Memphis, I remember the Black folks there telling me that they felt shameful about what happened. And again, it's communities all over the country where we feel this shame. How were you, Nicole, able to, well, did you ever suffer with shame, especially when you were diagnosed with your condition and you had a lung collapse? Did you feel shameful about it, or were you from the beginning very open and transparent about sharing what happened to you and then your healing journey?
Yeah, I think the hardest challenge for me with being in such a helpless place after all of the surgeries was one, recognizing that I deserved support, and two, learning what my support language looked like. I never had to ask for help before, and I didn't know what I needed most. People were sending me flowers, and I remember coming home each surgery and I would have all these beautiful bouquets of flowers on the table. And by the third surgery, the flowers would just send me into the deepest depression. The flowers made me think of death. It made me think of grief. Like watching the flowers die made me feel worse than I did if I wouldn't have had them in the first place. And I remember reaching out to people and saying, I love you. I am so grateful for this gift. Going forward, please don't send me any more flowers. I actually need food. I actually would love for you to come visit. I would love for you to get on FaceTime with me and find time to talk to me because I'll be home healing for the next 6 weeks. I literally had to learn what my support languages were
Mm.
and how to communicate that with other people. And so, um, breaking that generational issue of not being able to ask for help, for having to feel like you have to keep it all together and you don't need anyone, was something that I had to unlearn. We think about shame and we think about some of the unhealthy thoughts that we carry today. A lot of it was taught during a time where we were not wise enough to recognize that we were being poured this information so that we will follow instruction, follow the lead of others, and think less of ourselves. And so, um, I think about the church. I think about, how therapeutic church is today for so many of our people and even for myself. But there was a time where you went to church and the pastor was telling you to obey your slave master. And if you did not obey your slave master, you were going to jail. So
Mm.
these are things that we were taught from the very beginning, and I think we're still unlearning and questioning our beliefs. Like, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel that I don't deserve this? Why do I carry this shame? And I think the more that we question our thoughts, the more that we will recognize that these are, ideas and behaviors that have been passed down to us from our oppressors.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought that because trauma can also be passed down as well through generations. And I'm glad you brought up that example because, again, during the time when our folks were enslaved, it was a form of protection to tell them to listen and obey. It was a form of survival. And we've passed that down where, you don't talk back to a white officer. Why? Because it could lead to your death if you are a black or brown person in this country. So, to your point, Nicole, we have to understand where it's coming from, but we understand why those mechanisms were put into place and why we were even told these things so that we could prosper and survive as a people. Like I remember even, and I wasn't told anything that extreme, but I know as a young black girl coming up, my mom definitely would tell me, like, when you're in public, you act a certain way. When you're at the workforce, you do certain things, act like a lady. And again, these ideas, helpful in some ways, right? But now that I'm older, I understand the context and I understand how it can be harmful too. And you don't want to suppress your feelings and needs. And I'm so glad, Nicole, that when you started talking, you talked about, you said you're recognizing that you deserve help, number one, and you understood your communication. I mean, you understood the support you need, and you communicated that effectively. After you watched those flowers die, you said, this is not helping. I need time. I need some FaceTime, some quality time, or some food, etc. That is so important because I feel like too many of us are not in touch with who we are, our needs. And as a result, we don't know how to communicate it. And we don't know how to take care of ourselves. I mean, obviously, you've been doing this type of work your entire career, but if you can just walk us through, like, how do you get to a point where you, number one, feel deserving of support? And then number two, how do you communicate that, especially for those where, communication is a part of our expertise. That's what we do. But for others, that's not something that they're constantly working about or even thinking about.
Yeah, you know what? This is some work that we're all currently trying to master. Um, I talk a lot in the book about Black pride and campaigns centered around our beauty. um, campaigns centered around our worth. And so we are still to this day fighting to be seen and accepted. We are still fighting against policy that tells us if our hair is worn a certain way, we do not belong. And so, I can't just sit here and say that I'm now at a place where I've figured it all out and I feel good about who I am, and I am 100% proud of everything that I carry and do, because I'm still in this fight with everybody else, who is trying to pour into and empower young people in every generation as much as possible. With my work with the foundation, with Precious Dreams Foundation, um, I am trying to empower young people who have cycled through the foster care system that they deserve to have a family and that they deserve to break the cycle. And I'm trying to empower young people who have grown up in poverty and grown up in homeless shelters to believe that they deserve money. They deserve
Mm,
to have a healthy relationship with money and have their own, and they deserve to be homeowners and all of the things that everyone else is afforded. Um, and we're struggling because there is still, when I look at the organization, over 90% of the young people that we work with are Black and brown. And I am watching that, I am seeing that a lot of the issues that we face, we are trying to make up for the systemic barriers that are still in place, that have been put there and are continuing to this day, to be introduced as ways to suppress us and to hold us down, to keep us in the positions that we are so that we cannot climb the ladder. And it's really challenging. I think the best thing that we can do is continue to amplify voices, in our community of people who have overcome, people who have found success, so that young Black and brown people can see them and see themselves and know that one day they can do the same thing. I think sharing the education, whether it's through this podcast or through books, continuing to tell our stories, so that young people know that they deserve and they belong and they too can overcome, just in conversation and simple conversation, not just in the family, but, out in the world, just talking about all of the struggles that we're currently facing to make it easier for the next generation, because there's still so much unlearning that needs to take place, and we are still fighting every single day for our rights so that we don't have to walk down the street and behave differently from
mm,
everyone else because we're afraid that if we act out or speak out or say the wrong thing that, we'll be punished.
mm. I'm glad that you brought up Precious Dreams Foundation, a phenomenal organization that you've been running for over a decade now. A large part of your work focuses on helping young people heal, like you just said, through your foundation. And I wanted to ask you, has the little girl in you fully healed? And how did helping, or how does helping other young people heal inadvertently help your own process?
Ooh, that's a good question because Selena, I feel like we are always in need of more healing. On a daily basis, we are in need of healing. And when I think back to my childhood, there is a lot of trauma that I could call out and recognize, things that I can work through and talk therapy. And then there are also things that I can't really remember. There are experiences and traumatic experiences that, unconsciously I have buried. And so sometimes it takes new encounters and new experiences for me to recognize, like, hey, a trigger is happening here and I can't really pinpoint it. So I can't say that I have overcome all of my childhood trauma because I can't tell you everything that has happened to me as a child. Um, Without having a full understanding of what my entire childhood experience was, I know there's still work to be done. I also recognize that I am also carrying the trauma of the generations that have come before me, because of things like epigenetics, that tell us that, our experiences can change the way our genetic makeup is passed down. Because of things like that, I also could recognize that while I am doing my own healing, I also have some healing to do on behalf of my mother, on behalf of my grandmother who passed away, who lived her life having surgery after surgery, had multiple miscarriages, and who likely had endometriosis but never received a diagnosis. I am managing that pain. There's just so much that we carry. So I am continuously in a pursuit of healing modalities on a daily basis. While I have my, go-to tips and holistic practices that I have mastered that I can teach to the young people, I also recognize that I'm always looking for new ways to work on myself because I am constantly changing, and I am constantly learning new things. As you were saying, Selena, like there's still so much about our families and our history that we don't know. And so I am doing the work that I can to prepare for the information that will come, whether that is related to myself and to my own health battles and things that I will face ahead of the journey, or it has to do with my family in ways that I will need to show up, ways that I will need to guide or protect. So the work never ends, I don't think, for anyone.
When you say carrying the pain of your mother and grandmother, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, when we look at ourselves, a lot of times we can point back to past experiences, and how our environments help to shape who we are as a people. Um, and if we know our biological family, if we are privileged enough to know them, then sometimes we can point back to certain characteristics, that we see in our parents or in our grandparents, and recognize the similarities that we have. Um, Something that I have learned more recently is to recognize some of the pain that we have in common, and also to recognize the pain that is passed down. And so when I was a child, I remember seeing my mother cry often. She had this like sense of fragility, and she was always crying about something. I never really understood what was going on, but when she would cry, I would just start crying, and we were crying together. And now, as a grown woman, I have become so curious about her tears. And when I started doing this work and writing the book, one of the first things I did was pick up the phone and tell her how curious I've always been about her pain. And when she would cry, I could see that it wasn't just about the present moment. When my mother was crying, it was as if I could see a river flowing of all of the tears of the women and the ancestors that had come before her. And they were just flowing down her face. The pain was so deeper than whatever had just happened to her, whatever she was experiencing. And so as I became curious about those tears and started having more conversations with her about them, I started to learn about my mother's childhood trauma, and her grandmother's childhood trauma, and things that were passed down to her, things that she had seen. And so um, there's just a sense of weight that she was always carrying. And now as a woman, I can look at myself, and sometimes I'm so fast to cry. Like I, I don't see it as a weakness to cry, but now when I do, I feel like I'm shedding for everyone. Like it almost feels like I am releasing, and I am releasing for myself and for others, and it actually feels good. Um, I have no shame in my tears because I recognize that it's a practice that is setting souls free.
Mm.
And I recognize that it is something that, my ancestors were not privileged, and that we all deserve to do, and that we didn't deserve to have to cry in silence. There's silent tears, and then there's, the tears where you can cry to a friend or to a family member and get support in the moment. And that is what we truly deserve. We shouldn't feel the shame of having to cry behind closed doors and keep it together anymore. That's what community's for.
Thank you, Nicole. That was so deep and moving for me, even poetic, the way you talked about your mom's tears and just that stream, that flow. It wasn't just her, but the ancestors. I think for many of us, myself included, I don't even always allow myself to cry. Like I literally had to give myself a moment just like a few weeks ago because a lot of, I guess my friends would say I'm the strong friend or the one that people come to. And for me, when I had that moment and I was just like, let me release what I'm feeling through tears and not feel shame, it was so freeing. And I'm glad you speak about that. You write about that in the book because a lot of Black women, we don't always give ourselves that space to feel and to release because we're so many things to so many people and we put ourselves last sometimes, or at least our feelings.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, Selena, I think this past election has shown us that we cannot carry the world. Okay, so
Oh
it's
no.
time. It is
Yeah.
time for us to put ourselves first.
Yes.
We have to take care of ourselves. We're going to carry the village. If we're going to support the kids, if we're going to do all the things, like we have to prioritize our own care.
Absolutely. And speaking of prioritizing care, again, we know that you are a mother, you are also expecting. And I wanted to ask, like, what practices do you have in place so that your children don't necessarily feel the pain that you've went through and past generations? Is there something that you can do to sort of protect them from that pain or prevent them from feeling and also, carrying generational pain and generational silence?
Yeah. I think the biggest gift that I was not rewarded as a child was communication and an understanding of what was happening around me. A lot of times, I was told to stay in a child's place or, got sent to a room. And my son is 8 months old, and I have absolutely cried in front of him. And even if he cannot understand words, I will explain my tears. Sometimes I cry and, he looks at me and I say, Mommy's crying happy tears. Mommy's really excited because this just happened. Or, Mommy's a little sad right now because, she's having a challenging day. And I will continue to communicate with him so that he can learn to understand emotion. That is something that is so important to me because I had no idea how to juggle my emotions as a child.
Mm.
And I think that's why I had so much catching up to do in my 20s and why I really struggled with self love and self care. So, just communication is something that I will prioritize as a mother. And I absolutely encourage other people to do the same because it also allows your child to grow up doing the same thing for themselves. And when we can communicate our experiences and our emotions, we are really raising young advocates. We are raising people who can speak intellectually and go out into the world and express what their needs are and demand what they deserve.
Yeah, and I'm so, I'm encouraged by this next generation. I was around one of my younger cousins. He was 6 years old, and on a paper he wrote, "I am angry." And I said, "Rocky, why did you write that you were angry?" And he explained to me it was because one of the other cousins didn't want to play with him. And in that moment, I felt such pride. I was like, he identified an emotion, wrote it down, talked about it, and moved on. And I was like, I just love that for us. I think that for all the pain that our ancestors went through, every generation we see progress. We're getting better. And like you said, Nicole, it's all about just that communication and letting young people know, our children know that it is okay to feel, it's okay to express, it's okay to not feel like you need to be perfect, and you deserve whatever it is that you want and need. So thank you so much for sharing that. I know we do have to bring this conversation to a close, but before we do, Nicole, please let everyone know how they can get their own copy of Breaking Generational Silence.
Yes, so you can get a copy of Breaking Generational Silence wherever books are sold. But I will say, I encourage all of you to shop local and to support small businesses. So do that if you can. If not, I respect if you need to, order it from Amazon or wherever you shop. So you can get it everywhere online. And the other thing I would love to plug is the nonprofit. So
Yes.
if anyone out there is listening and they either want to volunteer or donate, you can look into preciousdreamsfoundation.org.
Amazing. And I'll just end by saying, fam, it's just time to do the work. I think so many of us are privileged to getting the information that we need and the education and these tools so that we can better ourselves and our children. And it's just time to take the actionable steps. I'm talking to myself included. Believe me, I am an advocate for therapy every single week. I am, talking to another Black woman who happens to be my therapist. Also giving myself space to cry and to show up. If I'm not having the best day, I'm realizing that is okay. And I want you to realize that as well, that we do not have to suffer in silence. There is community. And even if you find your tribe online or in a digital space, that is okay. Just make sure that you feel okay enough to express yourselves to others. Bottom line, we're all going through it. But it makes it a little bit easier to know that there's somebody else to go through it with, and somebody else who's actually already been through it and made it to the other side. So thank you again, Nicole. Thank you, everyone who is watching. And just continue to strive and thrive and push yourself over that hill.